Hello everyone and welcome to County Kerry in the southwest of Ireland. This is Carrigafoyle Castle, built in the 1490s and called the Guardian of the Shannon because of its strategic position here on the banks of the Shannon Estuary. But as awe-inspiring as this castle is, this video is not a history lesson. Across this bay to the north you can see an island, Carrig Island. Before it was turned to pasture for cows, it used to be forested and served to shield the castle here from the estuary beyond. It's not very big, and if you happen to look at it now on Google Maps, as I have, it very closely resembles the head of a dragon, come to rest perhaps for the final time where Ireland's famed Shannon River meets the Atlantic Ocean. A single road bridge connects the mainland to the island, where you will find a few farmsteads dotted between fields and a place to lodge for the night, where I will be staying this very night. But this isn't my first time here. I've come back to share with you another Irish folklore story. Driving across this bridge for the first time, I have to admit I was a little intimidated. It was dusk on a high tide, unlike now, and in the dim light it seemed as if the sea and mud beneath it, which is very deep, might just swallow me up. Thankfully, my little Nissan Micra made it safely across with me clinging to the wheel. However, at the end of my stay, I did ask the proprietor of the guest house here whether the bridge did ever flood, and if anyone had sunk to their doom. To which he told me the bridge had been raised in recent decades to make sure that such a thing couldn't happen. But he did recall a German couple who'd attempted to drive across on an exceptionally high tide some years ago and whose car had been stranded on this bridge, forcing them to get out and turn back. What about before the bridge was raised, I asked. Well, then the bridge was a foot or two lower, he said, but still safe enough most days. And before the bridge was built? I couldn't help but wonder what it was like 50 years ago or even 100. Well now, before the bridge was built was before my time, he said, but I did once hear a story. On the northernmost tip of this island, in the Dragon's Snout, is a defensive gun battery, built at the beginning of the 19th century to defend against an anticipated Napoleonic invasion. I've yet to lay eyes on it, but today I'm going to attempt to get there, because in many ways it's where this story begins. Back then, the bridge, which you can see behind me between the mainland and Carrig, was just stone and gravel, enough to allow a horse and cart to cross on a low tide. And during the building of the gun battery, every day masons and labourers would drive their horses across, carrying with them materials and tools to work on its construction. And at the end of each day's work, those same men would load up their carts and drive back across that bridge to their families on the mainland. Except on one particular day in the spring of 1803. A fisherman turned labourer was the last to leave the island, which at that time was still forested and unoccupied. It had been a glorious, bright day, and work had progressed well on the battery, such that it was dark when he came to leave. By the time he approached the bridge, the incoming tide had already covered the stone, but not enough, he hoped, to impede his return home. So he attempted to cross. But before he even reached the midway point, the wheels of his cart had begun to sink. It turned out in the darkness that his horse had strayed from the stone track and slipped into the deep mud of the bay. The man dismounted the cart, panicking, and frantically attempted to coax the horse backwards onto the road, with the sea first up to his waist and soon after covering his shoulders. The terrified horse kicked up sediment and water in its attempt to gain surer footing. But by a miracle, they made it back onto the road. The horse, though, was too traumatized to go on. So the man drove it back to the island in what was now complete darkness. For there was no moon that night, and even the stars were partially shrouded in cloud. What had been a glorious day was now a cold, and in the case of the fisherman come labourer, very wet night. His clothes were soaked through from wading through the estuary. He was shivering profusely, barely able to see in the dark, and worse still, it then began to rain, as only it can in an Irish spring. But unlike the rain, he could never in 1,000 lifetimes have expected what came next. From the back of the man's flooded cart came a sound that had no right to be heard in the dead of night, coming from a labourer's work cart. It was the shrill, high-pitched cry of an infant. In complete disbelief, the man's eyes followed the sound, and sure enough, between water-soaked tools, there lay a baby, no more than a year old, undressed and shivering as the rain beat down upon it. What in God's name? He couldn't believe his eyes. The man in his early 30s was a widower, having lost his wife just a year before to a storm while out fishing. He never spoke of what happened, but refused from that day on to go to sea ever again. They hadn't yet had children before she perished, but the man, despite his shock and disbelief, felt a need to help this mysterious child. He picked it up and held it to his chest for warmth, but realised quickly that his own sodden body, cold and shivering too, would be of little aid. He needed to seek shelter and fast, or the infant would surely die. The question of where it came from would have to wait. There were no buildings on Carrig Island back then, and certainly no people, only trees. So he ran to them, leaving his cart and the still traumatized horse to their fate upon the shore. But the trees were of little aid. They kept some of the rain off, but the ground beneath was as soaked as his own clothes. He couldn't sit down, for it would only make him and the infant colder. And there was no dry wood or tinder with which to start a fire. He searched, running through the trees with the child bawling in his arms. As time passed, its cries grew steadily fainter, perhaps slipping into sleep or unconsciousness. Desperation beset the man's face as he realised, after almost an hour of seeking, that upon this forested island there was nowhere to run that might save them. So he returned, defeated, to the shoreline, knowing that he must try yet again to cross the bridge back to the mainland, where the warm hearth of a nearby farmhouse might be the only chance of life that the child still had. But when he reached the shore, the cart was upturned and the horse gone. He looked in all directions but could see nothing. He called its name, but realised quickly that it would not be found until daylight, if at all. "I'll have to walk it then," he told himself, heart pounding at the thought. Within seconds of beginning to wade out across the stone bridge, the estuary was up to his neck. The tide seemed to have risen even higher. He held the child aloft over his head in desperation and continued on. But after just a step or two more, his feet no longer touched the ground beneath, causing him to panic and flail, struggling backwards to regain some footing. For, like so many fishermen of his time, the man had never learnt to swim. What chance had he then of making it across while carrying a baby over his head at the same time? It was hopeless. he turned and fled with what little strength he still had, back to the island. Standing yet again on the shore, he remembered the battery, the stone building which he'd laboured on that very day and so many before it. Not wanting to stop for fear of his increasing cold, he headed straight for it, around this shoreline, north to the tip of the island. Were there only something to burn, he cursed as he ran. And here it is, the battery, built to defend against Napoleon's forces 219 years ago. It's strange, isn't it, how stone and stories are the two things which time never seems to claim. Ireland is covered in stone structures, many far older than this, made from the land itself by the people who occupied it. And stories, well, the best ones live on forever. Upon entering the battery, the man and his infant charge at last escaped the unrelenting rain, but they also lost what little light the stars had offered and entered a world of absolute darkness. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face, let alone the child which he still tightly held. It was silent now, whether asleep or unconscious he didn't know. But its limbs were as cold as the ocean from which it had strangely appeared, and its hands, once flailing, now hung limply at its side. Only the slightest of warmth from its breath upon the man's neck told him that the child still clung to life, but for how long? Minutes passed, the rain at last relented to a drizzle. A new sound made itself known. It was the sound of wood hitting rock repeatedly, rhythmically. The man knew that sound like he knew the back of his own hand. It was a boat being tossed in and out, to and fro as waves hit rocks on the shore. His eyes widened. Was this their chance? A way of escaping that island at last? Outside, sure enough, he found it. Hitched to a peg, driven into the rocky shore, was a small wooden rowing boat. It was old and long forgotten, but it had oars, and though the man had never learnt to swim, his father had taught him to row at the age of 3, and until the death of his wife a year ago, he'd never stopped rowing since. Forgetting his vow to remain on land, he clambered aboard that boat, still holding the motionless child, unhitched its painter, and began rowing with every ounce of strength he still possessed. The tide was strong, the estuary unforgiving, but all he had to do was reach the mainland, less than half a mile away. Surely. He didn't notice at first. He was so set on that distant shoreline and the effort of each stroke of those oars. It wasn't until the boat was some 40 feet out into the estuary that he finally saw her. Opposite him, on the boat, there sat a woman. She stared at him. He stared back, almost dropping the oars in terror. "You. It cannot be," was all he could say. For that woman was his wife. The same wife who he'd watched sink to her death a year before on that very sea. She sat quite still, unshivering, unaffected, as if not quite real or attached to the world around her. "Why did you kill me?" she said, in reply. The man's face turned white, his expression a mixture of terror and grief. I had no choice. They blamed you for the storm. They all said what bad luck it was to bring a woman on a boat. Throw her to the sea or it'll claim us all. That's what they said. I had no choice. Liar, you threw me to my death because you believed I was to blame for that storm, because you believed my death might spare your life and the life of those men. It was your choice, not theirs. He looked down into the lifeless eyes of the child on his lap. We all lived, he said, sobbing. The woman nodded. And I might have too. The mainland was no longer half a mile away. The boat had been carried out by the strong tidal current of the Shannon and was now a mile or more from the shore. No matter how much he rowed, expending the last dregs of his strength, the man knew it was a hopeless effort. The Shannon had already decided his fate was to be spat out into the Atlantic Ocean as punishment, as retribution for his act a year before. All he could do was sob, row and sob. A male voice then spoke. If you wish to live still, then throw the child into the sea whence it came. Then row until you can row no longer, and you will wake upon the shore. In place of the man's wife, there now sat a stranger, who looked no less solemn than she had, but altogether more real. "Who are you?" asked the fisherman. But the stranger would not answer. Instead, he repeated with still more emphasis, "Throw the child into the sea. It is near death anyway. Do it. To save your own life. Do it now, or you too will die." The child was indeed near death. Its face was white, and its torso was now as cold as its fingers. Even if transported that very instant to a warm hearth with dry clothes, it would surely have been beyond saving. "I know what you are," said the fisherman to the stranger. "You are my punishment, my reckoning. You are one of them, aren't you? A fairy from the other world." "And you," said the fairy, "are a murderer. So throw that child into the sea and live as a murderer. It is your only choice." The man held the child against his breast. The fairy was right, was he not? They would both die anyway. Shouldn't he save himself then, take the fairy's bargain? He looked down at the infant once more. "Are you still alive, little one?" he whispered. But it showed no movement and made no sound in reply. "Breathe," he urged. "Just once, please." A single breath from the infant's mouth fell upon his neck. It was shallow, but it was life. "I have already made my choice, fairy," said the fisherman. And with that, he took off his clothes, wrapped them around the child, placing it gently upon the deck of the boat, and then, without hesitation, he jumped into the cold, dark waters of the Shannon Estuary and sank like a lead weight into its depths. The fairy watched, but said nothing. The next morning, masons and labourers arrived back at the battery just on that hill here on Carrig Island. The sun was once again bright in the spring sky, and they were eager to set about their work with warm hands. Until, that is, one of them noticed a boat right here upon the shore, and in it, a bundle of clothes, ragged but dry. Inside the bundle, they found a child, warm, breathing, and seemingly unharmed. She was adopted by a local family, the first to build a house here on the island, and grew up to be bright and strong in all ways save one. She had a terrible fear of water and would never learn to swim. And the fisherman, was his body ever found? Well, apparently not, but this is where it's hard to tell where one story ends and another begins, because I am told that a giant pollock lives in this estuary, which for 200 years people have been seeing along the coast of Carrig Island, but no one has ever been able to catch. Perhaps it's my lucky day. You never know. Okay folks, it's time for me to retreat back to the lodge where I'm staying tonight. Rain is in the air, and although I didn't catch any fish, I definitely don't want to be caught in a storm on this island. Something tells me my bed is going to feel all the more cozy tonight after telling that story. And don't worry, the Mossy Bottom crew are all being well looked after. I'll be heading back there in the morning. And remember, if you enjoyed this tale, then there are more folklore stories on my channel just like it. Do take a look. From me though, here in rainy County Kerry, to you wherever you are in the world, take care, look after each other, and bye for now.